Buddy, it's little old me again. We are on chapter 2, video 4 right now. And if you'll recall, we ended off with the 6 constitutional principles. But it's important to note that even when the Constitution was developed, its ratification, which means its agreement, was not a foregone conclusion, that debates were fierce. We seem to think that this is a time of such political upheaval and God, people are disagreeing worse than they ever have. During this particular period, guys, or at least a few short years after this, people had duels regularly. Like Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel. So the sorts of disagreements that they had were profound. Whether or not slavery would continue, whether or not the president would serve for life was a debate, whether or not federal judges would serve for life. These were all ultimately the sorts of debates that they were having. Oh yeah, we already brought up the Bill of Rights, whether or not a Bill of Rights would even be included. They came from a variety of different backgrounds that we'll be looking at, but let's focus in on the particular question for this to help zero us in on exactly what we need to be focusing on. What were the factions or divided groups at the Constitutional Convention, and what compromises did they make to ensure the replacement government under the Constitution would be ratified? In other words, how did they get from no chance to, okay, that'll work? So let's take a look at support for the new Constitution. I want you to notice some patterns. This might just look like kind of a hodgepodge here of different colors, but what I want you to notice here is that a lot more of the brown or the Federalists concentrations here that you see are along prominent coastlines. Many of the people that were Federalists were shipping interests here, or people with large plantations. Those further inland or in more rural areas that were not seriously developed tended to have larger anti-Federalist majorities. And just to recall, Federalists supported the new Constitution. They wanted a much stronger national government, whereas people in the rural areas or country or further away from cities wanted a more decentralized government like they had under the Articles. If you'll recall, under the Articles, state and local governments had a lot more power. States were totally sovereign. Heck, under the Articles, they were using whatever coinage or currency they wanted. They formed alliances with other countries if they wanted. They had monopolies within their states if they wanted, if other states wanted to go through. In other words, they operated like little countries. And if you're located far away from the coastlines, you don't want a whole lot of government control. That strong government control is going to remind them of the British. But those along the coastlines had a lot more at stake, and they had a lot more power and property that they wanted to hold on to. So there's definitely a class dynamic with these constitutional debates. Now, what the Federalists did is that they formed a group, and the dominant part of that group was John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. It's worth noting that James Madison is referred to as the father of the Constitution. He is one of the chief writers. However, Hamilton was one of the chief writers of the Federalist Papers. Let me clarify what it is that we're talking about here with the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were used to try to convince the states, because they're the ones that had to ratify this new Constitution, to ratify the Constitution. In other words, the Federalist Papers were a way for them to say, hey, look, it's a good new government. Take a look at this argument. You should ratify this new government here. We're going to be taking a look at a handful of Federalist Papers, the first being Federalist Paper number 10. This was written by James Madison. In it, he spoke a lot about factions, and his concern was the threat that large majorities posed, as they did in Massachusetts, but also the threat that very small, concentrated elites had. He argued that if we had a large republic, you'd have all kinds of competing interests against one another. You'd have shipping interests, you'd have farming interests, you'd have banking interests, you'd have tanning interests. You'd have a variety of different groups that were vying for power, and because of that competition within this large republic of 13 states, okay, that no one of those interests would be able to get all the power, which is why he argued for a large republic as opposed to the smaller republics under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, under the Articles, they operated like tiny little countries. He was arguing that that's a way for one group to get a majority of the power, whereas under a larger republic of 13 states, they'd have to ultimately fight for power there, so no one group could get too powerful. Now, so what are those factions of those groups? I threw that term out a lot. Remember, factions just means, guys, competing interests or competing groups. They are not necessarily for the larger group whole. They are not necessarily for everybody. For instance, a teachers union or a internet association like Amazon or Google, they're not necessarily pushing for legislation to the benefit of everyone. They're pushing for laws and legislation that kind of benefit them, right? So that's why understanding factions and the term factions is so important. But let's take a look at who the founding fathers were. One, they averaged 42 years of age, and that might sound old to you, and it kind of was then. 42, they didn't last much longer, so they were definitely on the older side. Most of them were formally educated. Princeton, Oxford, okay, these are not like the rest of the population. This percentage is exceptionally high for that particular period of time. Their political experience, you can see that the vast majority of them were within the Congress of the Articles of Confederation. You can also see that there's a slight tilt towards northern states rather than the southern states here. That's going to factor big in their debates on things like slavery and what sort of power Congress would have on regulating or controlling commerce. And finally, here are the backgrounds that they came from. Finance, or like banking, right? Investing. Plantation owners. Farming there, law, manufacturing, trade, real estate, and land speculation. George Washington was a land speculator. What that means is that he had a lot of potential wealth at stake if they ended up with the new constitutional system there. So like I said, class is very much a factor with these constitutional debates. Now, what are some of those economic issues? Some of them had to do with the way states paid off their debts. You may have watched or listened to Hamilton and seen something about the debates over where or whether or not we would have a national bank. Hamilton said that it was absolutely critical that we have a national bank that helps provide the currency for the entire United States. Up until that time, remember, states were doing their own currency. They might have been using Spanish currency. They might have been printing their own currency, maybe French. They had a combination of all over the different places. And you can imagine how hard that would make it between different states trading with one another. Moreover, a number of the states had different debt levels. Much of the fighting took place in the North, and they had a larger portion of the debt because of that. Fighting was done in the South as well, but they were able to pay off many of those debts sooner. Well, one of the things that Hamilton argued for was that under the new constitutional system, that the national government would assume the debts of all the different states. In other words, if I'm a Virginian, I'm going to have to pay the debt for Massachusetts as well as the rest of the states there. You can imagine how many southern states felt about this. They felt that that was ridiculous because they'd already paid off their debts. Why should they have to pay somebody else's? You hear similar arguments being made today about things like healthcare. But the national bank and the assumption of debts were among the biggest debates there. If you'll recall, Hamilton settled that debate over the national bank with locating the capital, which had been in Philadelphia, to Washington, D.C., which is wedged between Maryland to the south and Virginia to the north. So it's very much located within the South there. I'll let you take a look at the slide here to take a look at some of those other issues. One of the other issues, guys, had to deal with larger or more populous states and smaller, less populous states. During this particular period of time, Virginia was a very large state, a very populous state. They had very many people there. New Jersey, though, had a much smaller state, meaning it was a lot less populous during this particular time. So Virginia is like, hey man, we need to make representation based on population. In other words, the more people that we have in our state, the more people we get to have in Congress. Okay? Whereas New Jersey is like, no, like we just want it based on equal representation there. So all states get the same number of representatives. Well, you can imagine how Virginia felt about that. It's also worth noting that Virginia wanted what's called a bicameral legislature. Okay? which represents two different houses, versus New Jersey's unicameral legislature, which only represents one. Well, what they decided to do, the founding fathers determined that we're going to set up the Great Compromise that blends both of these plans. So we're going to have a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, which is based on population. Okay, so a state like Virginia can have far more representatives, but a state like New Jersey can have equal representation within the U.S. Senate, which is that second house or second body within the U.S. Congress there. So that, folks, is what's known as the Great Compromise, and this is how they settled the dispute between small states and large states. Because while on one hand, larger states get more representation in the House, smaller states still get equal representation within the U.S. Senate. Now, there's some big problems with that. And you may have heard some of the debates about that right now. What you need to know about that is I want you to think here real quick. If today, for instance, we don't have 13 states, we have 50 states. If a state like Wyoming, okay, located right here, has the same number of U.S. senators than California, which is located, believe it or not, right here, well, then obviously that gives them a disproportionate amount of power within the U.S. Senate. Think about it like this. Wyoming has a few 100,000 people in the entire state, whereas California has 35 million people in the entire state. So here in California, we have two senators to represent over 35 million people in that state. And here in Wyoming, we have two senators to represent a few 100,000 people. Obviously, that leads to a grossly disproportional system. It's one of the reasons why people have a real problem with the Senate as it is, particularly with powers like the filibuster. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, one of the other problems that you saw during this particular time, and one of the challenges for the founders, was the issue of how to count representation. You saw a moment ago that the North had 7 states and the South had 6 states. You also, I'm sure, realized that the vast majority of the slaves were in the South. Not all, but the vast majority of the slaves were in the South. The population of whites, who would be the voting population at this particular period of time, was also much, much lower in the South. And this is ultimately why the South felt we're going to lose everything in the House unless there's a greater means of representation. And this is where the 3/5 compromise comes into play. How it works is ultimately this. Okay, for every 3/5 of the slave population within a state could count as ultimately one person within that state. So, for instance, what this is ultimately going to do, guys, this simpler part of it is, remember how the House of Representatives is based on population? Well, if 3/5 of your population, okay, can count towards your representation in the House of Representatives, this is going to boost your power within the House of Representatives. The South's already got its representation in the Senate. Remember, it's equal. The 3/5 compromise boosts their representation in the House of Representatives as well. Now, does this mean that slaves could now vote? Of course not. If anything, these plantation owners were voting against their interests in each of these areas here. And this is one of the darker spots within the constitutional compromises. And as you can imagine, there's still debate today whether or not the founders of this government or this country made the right decision. There was yet another part in the Constitution as well. And today we call it the Slave Commerce Clause. But it's worth noting, folks, that nowhere in the Constitution does it use the word slave. Nowhere in the Constitution. You can see that they talk about this sort of thing, the migration or importation of such persons. Not slaves, of such persons. They weren't counted as persons either for the vote with the 3/5 compromise or with the Slave Commerce Clause. They were counted as property. But for the sake of convenience here, they could be counted as persons. And it's worth noting those inconsistencies here. And this is going to be one of our jobs this year. What this is effectively saying is that they cannot stop the importation of slaves until 1808. Um, After that time, though, importation just means we can't buy them from other countries to be brought into this country. Okay, that's an import. An export is when we sell goods or products, thank God, not people anymore, to other nations. And this is ultimately saying we're stopping the importation of slaves after 1808. Again, nowhere in the Constitution does it actually use the word slave, though. And this, folks, is where we'll stop today. And I think it's important. What I want you thinking about is that question that we left off with a moment ago, and that was, did the founders make the right decision? Okay? Could we have had a constitutional system? Could we have survived without making these sorts of compromises? And let's say you answer, no, we couldn't have. Okay, if that's the case, how do we reconcile ourselves then with items like the Slave Commerce Clause, with items like the Three-Fifths Compromise? This is something we need to explore here and understand the compromises that were made. But just to sum up those compromises, there's a Slave Commerce Clause, there's the Three-Fifths Compromise, and there's the Great Compromise that was largely between large states and small states. And that's where we'll end today. Thanks so much for the time, everybody.